Hi, welcome back to Bexhill West. I'm James. Now in today's video we're going to review this, which is the Creality Falcon2 Pro 60 watt diode laser machine. Now this laser cutter and engraving machine at 60 watts is really very powerful indeed for a diode laser. You may recall in the past I reviewed the 22 watt Creality Falcon machine. I was really impressed with that, and I expect this machine to be very similar in terms of build quality and ease of use. What I'm mostly interested in is that 60 watts of power. What can I do with 60 watts that just simply wasn't possible with 22? Now, I'll say right from the start, when Creality offered this to me to review, I of course said yes, I'm really interested in this sort of thing, but they're not paying me to make a video. So whilst this is kind of like an advert for the machine, as far as they're concerned, as far as I'm concerned, it's an honest review. So whilst I haven't been paid, I haven't paid anything for the machine either. So yes, my review is likely to be biased. But I'm going to do my very best to be as open and honest with this machine as possible. I can already identify a couple of things that I think maybe could do with developing a little bit, but basically so far this seems quite impressive. Now I know that when I tell people I'm testing a 60 watt laser cutter, the first thing they're going to ask me is how thick a piece of material can it cut? Well, of course that's a bit of a silly metric really, but here we go. This is the second cut that I did with the machine, and this is a piece of redwood 20.5 millimeters thick. I got this from the local DIY shop, so it's not the best quality. It's probably also got a relatively high moisture content as well, and it zipped through it in one pass. Now I was blown away by that. I wasn't expecting it to, despite it falling within, you know, the parameters of what Creality say the machine can do. So if it whips through that at just over 20 millimeters thick, I wonder what other materials it will do. So really impressive. Anyway, let's have a look at this machine in a little bit more depth, and we'll get into all the details and we'll try it out with some different materials. So whilst editing this video together and getting to the point where we were talking about what will the 60 watt laser do, I was reminded of this little test piece that I did. So that's engraved obviously onto a Stanley blade. Quite amazing the depth of engraving on here. Now this was my first attempt. I guessed the settings, but I mean, it looks tremendous. You can see the penetration right through. Anyway, that reminded me I had another test piece, and here it is. They say that the 60 watt laser will cut through 0.3 millimeter stainless steel. Well, I had a go with this blade. It's cut right through it, and if we measure it, it's actually 0.6 millimeters. Quite incredible. Amazing. Now, I'm not going to do the full-on unboxing and assembly in this video. I'm sure there's going to be loads of videos on YouTube, and every single one of them will do a natty little montage with a bit of music and everything else showing the operator using a screwdriver. All I will say is this thing went together so easy. The instructions are really clear, handy if you can read. Even if you can't read, the diagrams alone were superb. Anyone could put one of these things together. In essence, there are two side frames, a cross rail on the top which houses a camera, we'll talk about that in a minute, and side panels that just screw on into pre-self-tapped holes. The whole thing it couldn't be easier. Now I will say that as it came, this panel here on the left hand side of the machine had the exhaust fan. I swapped them over and I put the exhaust fan on the right hand side of the machine, just because it suits how I've got the thing set up here. And you could see it just sort of draping away there. That disappears off, connects to another bit of pipe, and it goes outside. So other than that, this is all exactly as it came. You may well have seen similar videos of similar machines, Falcon machines, so you probably know more or less what we're looking at. We've got, instead of a honeycomb in here, we've got a slatted work table, aluminium slats. You can see this one's already got some battle damage, which is nice to see. I've done that already, cutting things. They are adjustable, and indeed you could take them out if you wanted to put a honeycomb table in or a rotary setup. Now what's really great about this is the drawer, so we can open the drawer up and pull out all our bits of scrap and stuff. Really well thought out. Now you'll see, hopefully you'll see when we get this thing running, that there's no smoke evacuates from this machine at all. When it's running, even cutting through thick old stuff like that, all of the smoke is cleared away by the exhaust fan, which is brilliant. It's got the familiar Creality Falcon control pad. We can have a look at that in just a minute. We've got an e-stop button, the key lock, which I quite like. You can take the key out, walk away, no one's going to fiddle with the machine. Let's just put that back before I forget. And of course we've got the air assist unit as well. We'll look at that in detail in just a minute. Now if I slide this forward, the laser unit in here itself, and we'll look at this closely in a minute, it is massive. This is insanely powerful, really quite remarkable indeed. Now if I turn the machine on, we've got a couple of, there we go, it does this little beep to run through its routine. This is now, let's turn the air assist off. This is now pretty much ready to go. There's some things on here that I really like. For example, it has an LED light bar in the front here. We can see clearly inside. That is, we could turn it off, or rather we can have it on permanently, and then we could turn it to auto. When it's in auto mode, it comes on when the machine is running. I just think leave it on is better. Similarly, the fan, the exhaust fan, currently I've got it set to auto, and that would automatically come on when the machine is working. In reality, in use, it's probably better to switch the fan permanently on. The reason why I say that is when the machine's finished, you can leave the fan running and properly evacuate all the fumes and stuff. It works really well. So let's cut something first of all and see how it does. So then for our first cut, let's do something nice and simple. I'm just going to cut a simple straightforward square out of this material that I showed you earlier. So that's over 3/4 of an inch thick. Now I'm going to drop that into the machine. It doesn't really matter where we put it. I'm going to put it somewhere in the middle. And if we jump over to light burn, I can click the camera icon at the top of the screen, and that's going to give me a view of that piece of material as it is sitting there in the machine. Now under the camera control panel on the right hand side, I can deselect the fade. That gives me a sort of a more lifelike view, and we can see our piece of timber and we can see the grid overlaid on top of it. So if I draw, let's just draw a random shape in. Under the cuts tab, I'm going to choose my speed and power, and for this job I'm going to use 140 millimeters per minute at 100% power. So if I click frame, just check that the laser head is going to sit above the material. It should do, because I've already calibrated the camera lens. So let's close this and we can run the program. So that is now cutting, as I say, 140 millimeters per minute at 100% power. It's not too noisy, although I'm aware that the sound of the fan is coming through my camera and my microphone as being a little bit louder than it actually is. It isn't that loud at all. Really quite comfortable indeed. And there is no, this is a very resinous piece of timber that's producing a lot of smoke inside the enclosure there, and all of that smoke is being exhausted. There's none sort of leaking out around the machine at all. So the job's finished. I've got the fan set to auto. It will continue to run for a little while, just to clear the last of the smoke. Anyway, let's stop it there. So the fan cycle hadn't yet finished, but hopefully you could see there's all the exhaust fumes are all gone. And here's our cut. Now, it hasn't actually cut through. There's a couple of little bits here where it's still retained. Let me get a knife. Now I'm surprised because when I did a test that had cut right through, so I'm just going to see the extent by which that hasn't cut through. I think it's just a few fibres here that are holding that in place. I think that, yeah, that feels like it's about to pop out. So there we go, you saw that, that was relatively quick, one pass. I'm not sure if the camera's going to pick up on that, but the quality of the cut is first class. What I also find quite interesting is whilst I'm getting a little bit of the charring coming off on my fingertip, it's not much. It's relatively clean cut. I think it's fair to say that I'm really impressed with the quality of the cut of this thing, but we must acknowledge the fact that it didn't cut through completely, and in fact there were a few little wispy bits that I had to trim off with a knife. Now I'm going to take you in really close and have a look at those bits that I had to trim, because I think that's some useful lesson here about laser cutting in general. So if we look closely at that cut, and particularly the end grain and the growth rings of this piece of timber, you can see that if we zoom right in, where those little wispy bits remain that were trimmed at the end, they coincide with the annular growth rings that this tree has acquired as it was growing. Now, the density of the timber changes throughout the year from early spring growth through to later on in the year, and you could see that these bits that I've had to trim coincide with little denser parts of the growth ring. So that's why those bits haven't been trimmed. It's just the material is slightly denser, and the lesson there is that naturally occurring timber just behaves unpredictably. If this was a man-made timber, but like, let's say, a laser grade MDF or something like that with a consistent thickness, or a piece of plastic or something like that, obviously the cut will be more consistent. But whenever we're working with a natural timber, we've got to expect some variances with how they cut. Overall though, this is brilliant. I'm well chuffed. Having done a few cuts now, let's take a moment to have a look at the laser module itself. Now this is very similar to the 22 watt laser that I had reviewed previously. We've got the indicator lights on the front that indicate that our air assist is performing as it should. There's a fire monitoring sensor on here. We'll look at that in just a moment. This is really good, and I'll show you an example of just how useful that is in a moment. And also there's an indicator to tell us that the lens is nice and clean, or rather it's becoming dirty. Now if we turn this over and we have a look into the underside of the unit, although I've not used this much so far, I have been cutting through some very thick resinous timber, and hopefully you could see that there is a bit of a build-up of the products of combustion, the resins and what have you that have been released from the timber. Now this does need to be kept clean. A little cleaning cloth is supplied, and with most materials that are cut, just a wipe over is sufficient. But when you get particularly resinous materials such as that timber that I've just been cutting, sometimes it's useful to use a cleaning product. Now the verdict seems to be out as to which is the best thing to use. Dawn kitchen spray is highly recommended by many people. I found that anything with a citrus base to it, so something lemony or something orangey, the citrusiness of the cleaning solution really does cut through this sort of grease and grime, so it's well worth keeping this nice and clean. I would caution against spraying liquids down inside here, because obviously there are electronics and stuff inside here that we want to be careful of. I'd also recommend just simply taking a vacuum cleaner regularly and vacuuming out the cooling grills at the bottom here and the cooling fans on the sides of this unit. One thing that I've noticed is when running at 60 watts, particularly through a thick material, this does get hot. It generates incredible heat in the material that you're processing, but also there's incredible heat coming from here. So any dust that collects inside these cooling fans is going to affect performance. Just as with the 22 watt one, the nozzle unscrews, we can get into the lens behind to give that little wipe or a replacement. The lens needs to be considered a consumable part, but they last for a very, very long time, much longer if you clean them. Now you can see here the flame sensor. We'll talk about that in just a second. But if I flip this thing over, really it's at the top of the unit that all the exciting stuff happens. Now I'm just going to mention, this is something that I think is brilliant with the Creality machine. And if you're interested in a machine, whether it's a Creality one or any one, check the quality of the connection of this cable into the top of the laser module. So this thing traverses backwards and forwards constantly when it's in use. And you want to make sure that you've got adequate support where that cable enters the top of the unit. I have had experience with other machines in the past whereby that connection isn't quite so solid and the movement causes the individual cables to fracture. I don't think this is ever going to fracture. This is really good, nice quality cable. The plug on the other end is also excellent. But what's really interesting on the top of this unit, we've got a little dust cover here which peels off and we can connect our air extract hose. There's another little dust cover which reveals a USB port. That allows us at some point, should we wish to make firmware upgrades to the electronics inside here. For most people that's just unnecessary to use, so we can keep that covered up. Of course it's useful to take 5 volts out of there for a laser pointer if you wanted to add one, although with the camera system that comes as standard with this, that's sort of obsolete. There's also a little button here which allows us to select between precise, normal and powerful laser settings. So precise is 22 watts, normal is 40 watts and the powerful is the full 60 watts. And basically by scrolling through those, what we're doing is we are deselecting certain numbers of the LEDs inside here to reduce the power. Why would we want to do that? Good question. We'll look at that again in just a minute. So I'm going to put this back together and let's do a cut in precise, normal and powerful. We'll use those settings. We'll run at a constant speed and we'll do some engraving and we'll see what the difference is in the engraving. And I would expect that as we go from precise to normal to powerful, the engraving to become deeper. So let's reassemble this and see how we get on. Okay then, so for this little test I'm going to use some of these little plywood tags, and so I'll place that piece of material into the machine, and if I jump onto Lightburn, I click the camera icon to update the image, we could see I've got a piece of scrap material and I've taped that little plywood tag to the surface of the scrap material. Now I'm not going to cut all the way through, it's just an engraving, but the reason I've taped that down is because the cooling fans on the unit are really powerful and I don't want that to sort of get blown out of the way. So if we stick a piece of simple text onto here, so we're going to be in precise mode at 22 watts, and if I just, you can see how easy it is to position this to suit our blank. We can do that on screen and we can fiddle about with that, adjust it how we wish. So that's pretty good. I'm going to click home. The machine is already homed, but we'll just double check and frame. and I'm able to take a look, because we can frame the job with the guard open. I can just see that that's all lined up perfectly. Now I can close the door and we can run the job. So let's do that. So then that's our first piece cut, and remember that was on our fastest speed, 100% power, but at 22 watts setting on the laser. So we'll run at 40 and 60 now, and then we can compare the three. So then this is the outcome from that little test. We've got the 22 watt, 40 watt and 60 watt settings. Now I've run this at the same speed for all three pieces, so that's 25,000 millimeters per minute, and hopefully that's sort of communicating through the lens reasonably well what's happened here. You can see powerful, unsurprisingly, has engraved a lot deeper. Now I'm not showing you the maximum engraving here, I'm showing you the maximum speed. So if you're interested in the laser as a means of sort of like a production machine, you can sort of see, well, that's the kind of the level of engraving detail that you're going to get at the full speed with the machine. Of course the machine's quite capable of completely cutting through any of these bits of material, but obviously, and we could get the same effect with the 22 watt as we're getting here with the 60, but we'll have to run the machine much slower. So that's really the benefit of having increased power. We can not only cut through quite thick material, but we can also run much faster. I mentioned the flame sensor earlier. I said it was important, and I think it's especially important with a machine that's as powerful as this, and I'll show you why. I had a go at cutting through a piece of 18mm plywood, which it did no trouble at all. I thought, well, I did that off camera, so I thought, well, let's repeat the process. So I had another go, and if I get my workpiece up here to show you, you'll see that it's again cut through no problem at all. But if we have a look at the 6, you'll see that's pretty burnt away. Now what's happened here is that this is a relatively cheap grade piece of plywood, and as happens with relatively cheap grade bits of plywood, you've got all sorts of unknown materials inside, and particularly glues. So if there's a void in one of the ply veneer layers and that's been filled with glue, that glue can ignite, and that's exactly what happened here. So this was happily going about its business cutting out, and it obviously ignited a piece of poor quality material inside here, and you can see that's completely burnt away. Now I was alerted to it because I could see through the cover that the flame sensor was triggered, and I stopped the machine and got in there, and sure enough this was ablaze. I mention that because on the 22 watt Creality Falcon 2 machine that I've been using, I've not had the flame sensor trigger at all, and it's perhaps unsurprisingly that once I've jumped up to 60 watts and going through a particularly thick piece of material where we're cutting full power very slow, I'm not surprised to find that we've got some burnage. I think that is a good example of why having the alarm system is excellent. In fact, the safety systems all round on here are pretty good. Whilst we're talking about safety, let's sort of address, there are I think 6 safety features of this machine. Obviously we've got the e-stop button and the key switch. We've spoken about those. We've spoken about the 3 different indicator lights on this laser head. Now it's worth mentioning, and again the camera is unlikely to pick this up, but we can see these lights when the guard is closed. So they light green to show you everything is okay. Presently the air one is flashing red because the air system isn't running currently. but I can see that that's flashing, and I can differentiate it between the red of the flashing air and the green on the others. Now, whether or not that communicates on the video, it probably won't, but rest assured you can see that. Now, I mentioned there was 6 safety features. The other one, of course, is the enclosure itself. This makes this a class 1 laser. That means that no laser light is visible, can escape from the enclosure in use, which means these things are a thing of the past. You don't need to be sticking your green specs on when you're operating the machine, which is, in terms of operator comfort, is brilliant. Now, I said I'd keep this review honest, and there are a couple of niggles that I have with this machine. They're not deal breakers, but I'm going to mention them because if we're aware of them, they can avoid them being a problem. The first sort of minor gripe, I would say, is that these 3 lights that illuminate the precise, normal and powerful indicators here, when the red cover is closed, it's very difficult to see if they are illuminated. You have to really peer over the machine, and the nature of the blue light just doesn't transfer through this red cover material all that well, so it's difficult to tell which mode you're set up in when the machine is closed. Now, I would sort of preface that criticism by saying that you really ought to be checking this when the machine is open and you're setting your material in the first place. That said, it would be useful if they were a little bit clearer. One other gripe I have, and this one again not a deal breaker, but it's worth mentioning, particularly if you're going to cut a lot of very resiny material, and this is based not upon this machine but my experience with the 22 watt machine, in that there's sort of a rail here and on the underside of this axis, and what can happen is the products of combustion, if you will, the resins and the fumes, the smoke and the dust that the machine creates, can and will settle on these in time. And you'll find, as many users of these machines have found, that after a while they'll build up, they'll tend to stick on the rollers on which this carriage moves and create an awful sort of almost like a grinding noise as it moves backwards and forwards, particularly at high speeds. Now, that's avoided by wiping these clean, and that's part of the sort of care and maintenance of the machine to make sure that doesn't become an issue. But it's not helped because these are anodized and have a kind of a matte surface to the anodizing. If these were a polished surface, then that would be easier to clean and less of a problem. I mention it because I've seen online lots of people asking the question, oh, my machine started making a noise, and I would guess that in most cases it's just because there's been a little bit of a dirt build up on here. Again, keep your machine clean, look after it, and it will look after you. And again, with the camera set up looking in the top here, we can just have a little chat about these slats on which the material is supported. Now, many diode laser users will be familiar with a honeycomb bed, and a honeycomb bed is fine, works a treat, but it's a real problem to clean. It's really difficult to clean the honeycomb bed well, to the point that I wouldn't mind betting that most people never clean their honeycomb bed up to the standard it was like when it's new. It's just almost impossible. Now, I've not had a go at cleaning these slats yet, but I know from experience with other similar machines that these are going to be dead easy to wipe clean. In fact, when I finished making this video, that'll be one of the first things I do, is that I will clean these and return them to their kind of, get them all cleaned up. And there's lots of reasons why we would want to keep these clean. Not only does it look nicer, but of course every time the laser passes over these sticky, crusty bits, it burns them again. So you put a new job on here, you start lasering your new job, and the reverse side of it gets spoiled with all of this mucky stuff kind of burning for a second time and being off-gassed onto the back of your job. So it's really worth cleaning these, and the fact they're removable makes cleaning them really easy. Now if you don't mind about removing the nice black sort of surface finish of these aluminium rails, you can pop them in a bag with some oven cleaner and clean them up with absolutely no elbow grease whatsoever. Anyway, I like those, I think they're great. And the fact that we could remove them and put a honeycomb in if we wanted to is also great. Again, as we're looking inside the machine, it's worth noting that the framework of this machine is built from sort of bespoke aluminium extrusions, and they do a really good job of integrating the mechanical side of the machine. So for example, this framework along the side here has a linear bearing for the carriage, and there's a bearing surface here and on the underside of the top of this frame too. It's really well thought out. And again, as with the 22 watt machine I reviewed previously, the pipe work for the air assist function is all neatly clipped away. That's not going to catch or snag on anything. Now whilst we're here, I'm just going to mention the drive belt. There's a drive belt on each side that moves the x-axis carriage backwards and forwards, and it's worth mentioning that this does need to be kept clean. So over time, if you neglect your machine, resiny sticky mess will build up on this drive belt. It will run around the drive wheel on each end of the belt. It will get stuck there, it will build up, it will accumulate, and over time you run the risk of the belt skipping a step or kind of slipping a tooth on the belt, and that's obviously going to sort of mess up the squareness of the machine. So there's not a great deal you could do to clean that, but give it a good brush with a nice stiff brush every once in a while. I've been using laser machines now for many years, and you don't need to do much to maintain them, but 10 minutes a week just wiping things down, brushing dust out of the way, giving them perhaps a vacuum out is well worth doing, and if you do that you won't have problems in the longer term. So then, would I recommend this machine? Yes, definitely. It has all of the excellent Creality build quality about it. It works straight out of the box. It's dead simple to assemble. That's why I didn't include the assembly in this video. It's just straightforward. Is this for everyone? Maybe not. It's expensive. It's their flagship machine, so it's sort of top end. And there's no doubt about it that most of what this will do you could achieve with perhaps the Creality 40 watt machine. However, if you're interested in cutting through really thick material and you want to do it in one pass rather than 2, 3 or 4 passes, then definitely having the extra power will be well worthwhile. Now I think this will also appeal to people with their own Etsy stores or selling on eBay and stuff like that. If you're using this machine to make products to sell, then the more power means you can make them faster, which means you can get more products turned around and all the economic benefits that go with that. Certainly if I was thinking of a 40 watt machine, I would be thinking that perhaps the extra to get the 60 watt isn't such a bad step up. Anyway, this is the first part of this video series. I'm going to do a second part, and in the next part we're going to build an architectural model. That's something that I sort of specialise in, I guess you could say. We're going to use the laser machine for doing it, and in that I will run through all of the tips and tricks that I use about, with laser cutters in general. So if you're interested in learning about that, but not necessarily this machine, there'll be plenty in that video which will be of interest to you, because it just applies to whatever machine you have got. But in doing so, I will be putting this thing through its paces to produce something, a real product. Hopefully we'll end up with something quite beautiful, and we'll learn a little bit more about how this machine holds up. So if all that takes your interest, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time. Cheerio.